Welcome. Thank you for those who've stayed for the long haul in the last session of the day, the last session of the conference. I have been asked to just double check that you're in the right room. So we're the REN presentation as it appears in the program. But what we will be talking about in particular is enhancing the educational research practice Nexus. In a moment I'll introduce my colleagues. So welcome to our symposium. I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respect to the Indigenous peoples of Australia that have been present at the conference this week. By way of introduction, this afternoon, a small representative of the Research in Education Network are speaking to the barriers and enablers of education research into practice. Our definition of practice is broad and multidimensional. It encompasses the practices of schools and teachers, as well as the practices of systems of education at the policy and decision-making levels. My co-presenters today represent education systems of government, Catholic and independent sectors, as well as the university academia. So we have Liliana Ruttinger from the Department of Education, New South Wales, Shani Prendergast from Catholic Education Melbourne, and Tiffany Roos from the Association of Independent Schools, New South Wales. And each of them will be discussing different aspects of the school research interface. Zoran Endikov from Department of Education and Training in Victoria will be reflecting on the policy relationship with research. I tend to talk about both settings in my presentation, and I'm from the Department of Education and Training in Queensland. And Mark Rickinson from Monash University will be providing a recap on the evidence of effective research translation in education. For those of you who may not know about the REN, we are a group of Australian educational jurisdiction research officers that are passionate about supporting the role of research in improving the well-being, educational and child development outcomes of children and young people. We provide the role of ethical appraisal of research applications, seeking access to education sites in each of our respective jurisdictions. And we are joined by Mark Rickinson, an expert in our topic of discussion, the challenge of traversing the educational research practice nexus. Okay. There appears to be a divide between the academic role of researchers who have a significant and essential responsibility to add to the body of research knowledge and are encouraged by their institutions to publish in high-standing journals, and the role of educators and policymakers tasked with implementing evidence-based initiatives, but often unaware or unable to interpret this evidence. This research practice nexus is not unique to education, but the stakes are arguably higher. There is a public purpose of education to develop active, competent and productive citizens with the skills to contribute to society, including as the next generation of researchers, educators and policymakers. As will be argued by some of my colleagues, the importance of research translation is possibly of greater significance in instances when practitioners, school personnel, are the research participants themselves. Sometimes one of the few benefits, and quite often the only benefit, to school staff from their involvement in a research project is that they receive some sort of feedback on the results of the research. As a general ethical principle, researchers should provide participants with a timely and layperson summary of the overall results. An academic paper may not be the most appropriate way to provide them with this feedback. The selected mechanism needs to be respectful, interpretable, not undermine the privacy of individuals and not be a source of additional risk. In practice, this means that different project and participant groups will often require a different feedback mechanism. In my department in Queensland, as with many other jurisdictions, we have been circumspectly reviewing our approach to the most appropriate and effective strategy for communication of research findings to enable translation. For the first time in 7 years, we have published a plan for research that articulates our priority for creating a culture of rigorous inquiry. This year, the department commenced its own $1 million research grant scheme, funding local projects of up to $100,000 per annum that demonstrate strong alignment with our research priorities. The translation of research outcomes into policy and practice are paramount to obtaining value for money from the grant scheme investment. From last year, we have also introduced a formal approach to assessing partnership proposals for the ARC linkage scheme. Again, it's important that consideration be given to both the initial value of research investment and how best to collaborate throughout the entire project, particularly as the findings emerge. We've recently adopted a framework espoused by the UK Department of International Development for guiding research uptake of funded projects. This research uptake framework embeds translation throughout the research cycle, from initial research conceptualisation to reporting and monitoring post-research, and it encourages a user-centric approach to translation and uptake. It has 4 stages: engaging with end users, which means identifying the end users early in the research process, considering their interests and the type of engagement required to support uptake. Building capacity, addressing the gaps in the translation skills of both producers and consumers of research, recognising that that translation skill might not necessarily sit in either of those groups. Tailoring communication strategies, identifying the key messages, implications, and expected benefits of research in line with end user preferences. And monitoring and evaluating uptake. And that means gathering data that assesses the uptake of the research findings and the extent to which the expected benefits are realised by end users. So whilst we are still in the early stages of adopting this best practice research translation, some initial activities that are consistent with this research uptake framework include: we are hopefully launching early next year a new application system and research database. It's under development. We're calling it Query, which stands for the Queensland Education Research Inventory. And it will streamline our research application process and publish details of studies cleared to occur in Queensland state schools, including the findings of that research as it becomes available. Prospective researchers through the new Query system will be required to articulate their plans to engage with end users and detail how their research findings will be communicated appropriately to stakeholders. End user engagement is a new criteria for appraising research partnership proposals in our ARC linkage proposal process and also for grant funding applications. We run regular research forums which involve often co-presentations with the researchers, the policy officers and the practitioners involved in the research, and we web conference these to support broader dissemination. A new research findings template has been developed for researchers to use when submitting their findings to the department, and this template encourages the use of non-technical language and the identification of the research implications in addition to its findings. A communication plan for research is being developed that will involve new web content and a variety of approaches to communicating and disseminating research findings, particularly for some of the projects that we invest in. As I mentioned in my introduction, this symposium is touching on different aspects of the education research nexus and our experiences in how to best position research so that it truly makes a difference to the policy discourse of governments and to the practice of educators in the field. We also recognise that decreasing the divide between research and practice is not the sole responsibility of researchers, that there are steps that can be taken by government departments and the non-state education sectors to facilitate the embedding of research into practice. Our presentation is unique in pulling together the perspectives of different education sectors, Australian states, researchers, practitioners and policymakers on what may be potentially described as a wicked problem of translation. I ask you to reflect during our presentations on how we can move forward on this issue and how we can ensure that the impact of today's discussion is more than the sum of its parts. I'd now like to hand over to Liliana Ruttinger from New South Wales Department of Education.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to our presentation today. I know it's the last session, it's a bit of a challenge. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a project that the research team has been working on for the past year. So we set out to identify innovative practice that was happening in our schools, and we were looking to practice that had been informed by research. We wanted to find out to what extent it had been informed by research. And we wanted to basically assess, what was going on and try and share, how this actually plays out in these particular, innovative schools across our whole network. So based on the recommendations from our peers and from other educators in New South Wales, we identified classroom teachers, principals and museum educators who are working both at the primary and high school levels, and these were people that that I'll be referring to as practitioners in this presentation. So quite a broad term, but that's who I mean when I say practitioners. And on the basis of these recommendations, we conducted interviews. So we ended up conducting 14 interviews, and from those developed 14 case studies. And we were looking to answer 4 research questions. What are these innovative, successful practices in teaching and learning? How have these practices been scaled? How have they been informed by research findings? And what kind of evidence do our practitioners use to determine whether or not they were successful? So today, I'm just going to be discussing the findings related to research use and evaluation of success. And just briefly, so you know about the kinds of practices that we're talking about here, we found programs such as whole school approaches to project-based learning, transformative leadership and culture changes, relating to things like positive behaviour for learning and nurturing democracy at sort of a whole of school level. We also found alternative organisational structures for schools, so Big Picture Australia is one example of something that we studied, and integrated curricula. So these are the kinds of practices that we're talking about. And we found that our practitioners were informed by research and active users of it. So that was kind of our first big picture finding. And what we found was that they're not passive consumers of research. They don't just accept research findings and apply them in their classroom unknowingly and blindly. They adapt them based on their context, based on their own situation. And they're very aware of the likely, changes they need to make based on their particular situation. So the other thing we saw was an activity space between research production and use. And this has been called the connecting web in other literature. And the participants in this connecting web are organisations, researchers and practitioners. And examples of these might be, so in the organisations, sort of knowledge brokerage groups, for instance, the Buck Institute, Edutopia, universities sometimes have dedicated sort of units dedicated to kind of communicating with practitioners. Researchers such as the Dwecks and the Haddies of the research world, so those focused on like synthetic literature, trying to synthesise broad bodies of knowledge. And researchers, and practitioners were communicating in this space through blogs and through social media such as Twitter and Yammer. So we found that practitioners are interacting with research in a range of different formats and settings. What we didn't see was an exclusive reliance on your traditional peer-reviewed journal article downloaded from the from a database and used in isolation. That was rare, it's exception more than the rule. What we did tend to see was practitioners reading books, attending conferences, downloading podcasts, reading and commenting on each other's blogs, following retweets from esteemed peers, and connected them to professional learning publications and prominent education commentators. We also saw them taking part in tailored workshops that were, explicitly intended to translate research findings for use in the classroom. So they were really drawn to these particular types of formats and settings in which to engage with research. So when we're looking at the kind of research that practitioners were engaging in, we found it was quite broad and extensive. So of the 14 interviews we conducted, we counted 70 different researchers or organisations that our practitioners are engaging with. There are some common characteristics amongst this literature. So firstly, we found that this is literature in which the audience is primarily intended to be teachers and not researchers. That's the secondary audience. So what this tells us is that that teachers are more responsive to research that is specifically communicated with them in mind. So this is research that considers the implications for classroom practice, and that is cognizant of the broader political and structural limitations that teachers are subjected to. So understanding the realities of life in a classroom, within a school, within an education system, all the constraints and considerations that teachers need to be thinking about when they're applying research in their classrooms. Another characteristic of this body of work was that tended to be synthetic. So I mentioned before the Dweck's and the Haddies. Our teachers are definitely accessing high calibre research, but they prefer, research that spans a body of work and consolidates it in as best as a way possible. So these works also demonstrated a balance between research, between theory and practice. So our practitioners do want to know the theory, but they don't want to know it at the expense of practical considerations, things that they're actually going to use in their classroom. And these works are intellectually challenging. So, we're talking about engaged and educated professionals. They don't want to be reading literature that's been, simplified or dumbed down. Unfortunately, that term is, used a lot. So they're actually drawn to literature that is dealing with really complicated and esoteric sometimes concepts, but that's been really communicated clearly to them. And this is a challenge for researchers. I mean, how do you do justice to your own work and yet still make it applicable for teachers to use in their classroom? So when we talk about the way that we saw practitioners using the research, I'm going to use a kind of a classification system that's been used in the past in other literature, which is the conceptual, instrumental and strategic use of research. So what we saw was a lot of conceptual use of research. And what that means is research that provides concepts which come to play a part in how problems are defined and serves as a source of knowledge, but not a set of instructions. So we saw less evidence of sort of instrumental use, and that's a very direct application of the research, very kind of strict and exclusive reliance on research. We didn't see much of this. And we also didn't see much use of strategic use of research, and that's the sort of use where it's used to legitimate a position or to defend a policy decision as a sort of political tool. We didn't really see that happening in our practitioners. So the other thing to know is that these practitioners are not operating in a vacuum. I mean, they're definitely not just thinking about the research and applying it. So they're incorporating their tacit knowledge, all of their years of experience in the classroom. So they bring that in, they combine it with this conceptual knowledge, and that's what we see in their settings. So it's never a direct application. So finally, we were interested in evaluating how our practitioners are actually deciding whether this was successful in their classrooms. So what were they using? and how did they know it was working? So what we saw was there was no over-reliance on any one type of data, so we didn't see exclusive reliance on quantitative data or exclusive reliance on qualitative. It was definitely a mix, and it was always fit to purpose. So, depending on the program, the data that they collected and used as a form of evidence was a good match. So some examples might be of quantitative measures of success, things like attendance rates, other things such as involvement in the SRC, so that sort of demonstrate, increasing numbers of students participating in the SRC. Enrolment demand from outside catchment areas demonstrates community kind of approval of programs and interest and support for these programs. And when we're talking about qualitative evidence, teachers and practitioners were using things such as the quality of student dialogue in the classroom, students able to articulate the goals and their reason for being in the classroom. So students that showed that they really knew what was happening and why they were there. So they sort of had a purpose for being there. Other signs such as, increased school pride, things such as students showing up wearing their uniforms, reduction in graffiti, and the school being talked about outside of, in the community, outside the school walls in a positive way, through feedback, through, informal communication that was happening amongst parents. So these are all taken as, evidence that the program was not succeeding. So in a sort of nutshell, the way that we sort of think about these practitioners is that they have a pragmatic approach to using research. They have a researcherly disposition to their work, and this means that they're critically evaluating what's working in their classrooms. They're making informed decisions about how best to use research in their practice. So that kind of evaluative thinking is what we saw across the board of all of these researchers. So thanks very much. And I'm now going to introduce Shani from Catholic Education Melbourne.
I feel like we should have put on wine and cheese in the home straight here. Thank you so much for staying on and you're part of this conversation. Is it going to upset things if I stand here with the filming? I'm pushing the boundaries. Okay, half and half? Okay, thanks. It's great to share this project that we have been conducting with Catholic Education Melbourne. We really wanted to find out as a jurisdiction how our schools are engaging in research projects and engaging with research and evidence. So as you would know, either in the research community or in a jurisdiction, jurisdictions receive hundreds of applications from researchers each year wishing to approach our schools. We, apart from some anecdotal evidence, don't really have a sense of how our schools feel about that. So from basic questions to how many times are they asked to participate in research? How many times do they say yes, no? What are their main reasons for saying yes or no? What are their views of the characteristics of quality research projects when they get something out of it? What about when things don't go so well? What's happening there? Do they value research and evidence? Do they use it in practice? So we sought to go through all of these questions in an inquiry over about 6 months. It was a phased approach. So the first phase was seeking school feedback through an online survey. We did some focus groups and also a couple of school visits to a primary and a secondary school. And we're now in phase 2, where we're sharing some of those findings with other jurisdictions, with the research community. We've had some very rich conversations with some Melbourne universities, sharing what schools have told us. And the main reason for us doing this is really, as a jurisdiction, we want to know how we can better support our schools in the research space. So we don't want to just be funders of research or gatekeepers. We actually want to be leaders and advocates and supporters and enablers in research, but we need to know what our schools think about it in order to make those good decisions. But we also thought, what a great opportunity to share what schools have told us with the research community, hence the session today. So this really is, in 10 minutes or so, just a snapshot of what we found out. So it really is just touching the surface. But I'll talk about part 1, so what schools told us about engaging in research projects, and then part 2, how they're engaging with research and evidence in practice. So firstly, we wanted to know, so how many times are schools being approached or asked to participate in research? So almost 80% of our schools said that they get 5 or more requests a year. And almost half are saying they get 10 or so requests a year. That's more than what we even thought. And in terms of how often they say yes, just under half are saying yes to only 2 or less research projects a year, and about half are saying yes to only 1 or none. So the average strike rate, and we actually compared which schools, how many times they were approached and how many times they said yes. So the average strike rate was about 1 in 5. Our hunch was about 1/3 to 1/4. When we fed that back to some school principals, they said, wow, we didn't realise we were so generous and participated in so much research. They thought they said yes less, but when we fed it back to researchers, they're saying, yeah, wow, it feels like that. We actually can't get schools engaged. So we wanted to know, well, when they're saying yes, what are the things they're considering? We gave them a whole heap of reasons, and we also gave a free text category, and they chose all of the ones that apply. And then we said, what's your number one reason for saying yes? If the research project aligns with their school improvement plan and their school priorities, they are more likely to say yes. But unfortunately, in the qualitative information in the focus groups, they were feeling that a lot of research requests that they get, those projects don't always align with what they see as core work of schools. Their number one reason for saying no, this won't surprise you, but we heard this loud and clear, not only in the survey data, but in the conversations, is if the demand on the school is too great. So that's not only in terms of the time to fill in a survey or have an interview, it's actually the coordination that's required often when they're participating in a research project. But they also understood if there was something in it for them and great benefit, and it might have involved some professional learning or capacity building or coaching, they understood that that extra time was okay if they were getting a lot out of it. So they were certainly weighing up that benefit versus demand. Just some other things that influence their decision to say yes or no. So while, again, schools acknowledge that they contribute to research for the common good, they also want to know what's in it for them. So there were a couple of research projects that they gave us some examples where we thought at face value, is there a lot of benefit? But they talked about getting a professional learning session for their staff. There was one on women in the aviation industry. And at face value, we thought, well, it's low risk, but what's the benefit? One school talked so favourably of it because they had a focus on STEM. They got a careers session for the Year 12 girls. The staff got a careers session. They said it was of such value. But as a system reviewing that application, we were a little bit like, oh, let schools decide if it's of value to them, but we don't see great benefit based on their application. So schools care when there is something in it for them. So trying to think about what you can offer as well. I won't go through all of these, just some of the highlights. Schools also, and it's a little bit unfair for researchers who don't have a school background, are a little bit critical when they feel the researcher doesn't understand their context. So they might not be very considerate of school timelines or where they're at, or just not understanding how schools operate, being perhaps a little bit demanding of what's expected or not aware of what other school priorities are going on. So as much as you can, seek to understand what's going on in the school and work with them. Also, as Ange said earlier, unfortunately, schools are telling us that they're not getting any feedback or a copy of the findings. Now, while that's a condition in all jurisdictions, I think, across Australia when we approve research, unfortunately that's not happening a lot. But when they do get the findings and when they're school-specific findings, schools are very appreciative and they're often prepared to say yes again if they know they're actually getting something out of it. And something basic, but I know it's probably not hard to change, they also value when the communications to them, the principal letter, plain language statements, are clear, concise, they know what they're up for straight up, and the time demand is clear. Unfortunately, they're not going to read through reams of paper to find out exactly what they're being asked to do, and they don't really appreciate it when it says it's going to take this long, but it unfortunately takes double. So again, just being really mindful of how a school receives that and what helps them make a good and quick decision. Okay, that's just a very quick snapshot of engaging in research projects. This is now engaging with research and evidence. So we were really pleased to hear from the survey that most of our schools really do value research and evidence. 80% highly value it. But unfortunately, only 34% of them told us that they only use it in practice often. Sorry, 34% only use it, often. So there's a mismatch there between valuing it but not using it. So in the focus groups, we really wanted to find out, well, what are some of those enablers and barriers to using evidence in practice? So when it is school-specific feedback, schools are finding that easier to make sense of and use it in the classroom, even in planning, in dialogue, their school improvement planning. That made a difference to them to make sense of it. But also how it's presented. So when it's engaging, it's synthesised, schools found that more accessible and easy to use. Also, if it's supported by leadership. So if leadership are modelling using evidence in conversation, in planning, meetings, in professional learning, that's easier for staff to engage as well. If it's built into the day-to-day. Some of the things that get in the way, no surprises there: time, cost, motivation, some of those logistical factors. But also there was a bit of a theme about confidence of teachers to use evidence in practice in the classroom. And there were some hunches there that we would like to tease out a bit more, that some schools felt that if a practitioner had engaged in their own research, such as through a master's or a doctorate, they were more confident to use evidence in practice. The other one, but we would want to tease this out further, was some leaders felt that if the more experienced teachers were actually more confident to use in the classroom. Again, worth teasing out a bit further. But why do schools value research and evidence? Well, leaders were telling us it really gives us a strong platform for our school improvement planning, for professional learning, but also some principals were saying it gives them a chance to actually bust some myths amongst their staff with some popular or traditionally held views. For example, around class sizes or learning spaces. So principals can actually use the evidence to actually have a constructive conversation among their staff. That came through in the surveys and in the conversations. The other thing around how, which links to what Liliana was saying, that schools, teachers, practitioners, they're not actually downloading articles necessarily as the first chance to engage with research. It's in interaction with their peers. It's within school, in professional learning teams, in conversation, trialling things in the classroom. It's often not engaging just by coming across an article, which is a big message for us as an education system. We can't just make research available. Access isn't always the issue, it's part of it. But how do we create the conditions where practitioners in schools can actually engage with research and evidence? And how do we make sure the programs that we implement are actually evidence-informed? I'll keep moving. So this is from the whole project, and I haven't covered all of these things, but just a good summary for you. So the 10 key messages that we're still playing around with a little bit, we're still, the data is quite fresh, what schools are telling us. So they receive many requests to participate in research, but they actually choose very few. They tend to engage in research that CEM or the jurisdiction is at least a partner in or leading. So there's something about trusting some of the research that we're actually engaging in, our commission research. So a message for us as a system that we have to play in this space and stay front and centre. It's important that it aligns with their research, their school priorities. They're more favourable to research that they see as relevant and that they're going to get something out of it. So there's some tangible benefits to them. They are critical of the demand on them too, but they are more willing to give more time and effort when they see that there's a benefit to them. Unfortunately, schools aren't receiving feedback, so we need to work with the research community, not as a compliance activity, that you just give them the final reports, that you actually understand that that's going to add value, not only for schools, but also for your research. That's going to make it more impactful. And also in the commission research and in feedback that schools provide examples of research that has made a lasting difference to them, they all had a theme of capacity building. So it wasn't just going into the school, gathering data and leaving. It was actually, it had a coaching element, had professional learning. That stood out for them. And as a jurisdiction, research that we commission would have to have a strong capacity building component. As I said earlier, teachers and leaders are actually accessing research and engaging with each other within schools. So it's not always from the jurisdiction or the research community, but their first point to come across some research and evidence is often from their peers. And lastly, a supportive leadership and culture in schools really enables and helps teachers and practitioners engage with research and evidence in practice. So some great stuff for us to use as a jurisdiction and to do things differently. We're still unpacking what that means for us, but certainly we've already got about 6 key recommendations that were approved by our research committee this morning. And in our conversations with universities too, they're keen for us to come back and work with student researchers and supervisors to share some of this so we can actually work together to do better quality, high impact research that meets the needs of schools. I'll hand over to Tiffany. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you about what we've been doing in New South Wales within the independent sector as a way of supporting practitioners to engage with school-based research. We know that there's a problem or an issue in schools with the research to practice gap. Some estimate that it can take more than 20 years for research-based advances to surface in classrooms. Why this would be the case can sometimes seem baffling, particularly when educators are so often looking to improve the educational outcomes of students to the best of their abilities. A surfacing of the literature reveals a wide range of reasons for educator reluctance to engage with research. One important issue for practitioners is the form that many research products take. Articles are often obviously written for publication, not necessarily for implementation in the classroom. And the knowledge produced can be purely informative and appear unconcerned with practical outcomes. This kind of knowledge product is sometimes perceived to be of little value or use to educators. Practitioners are motivated by the practical. They want to know what works. There is often little indication of how to bridge this gap, and dissemination practices that are aimed at audiences other than academics appear slow to resolve this issue. For some classroom practitioners, research may be seen as a competing voice of authority. It is one source of information among many, and one that might not carry as much weight as the knowledge of their colleagues or their own professional experience. This may be due to the impersonal, impractical, and generalised nature of some research. As mentioned, practitioners are looking for the practical. The sheer volume of research outputs, much of which practitioners sometimes perceive as being difficult to access, overly scientific, abstract, technical, and often failing to be practice-focused, make much educational research appear difficult for educators to deal with, let alone to put into practice. Other factors that contribute to the lack of research engagement and inclusion in practice include that lack of time that we've talked about for practitioners to engage in the research process or with research. There are some school cultures, believe it or not, that may not be research-oriented. And there is also amongst teachers sometimes a mythology of what is good practice. The power of habit over change can sometimes be incredibly powerful. And then there are issues of teacher professional identity, and sometimes not all of us have the research literacy that's required to engage with research. So how to tackle such barriers? I'm sure all of us in the room here think that a multi-pronged approach is required. The value of practitioner research in generating context-relevant knowledge and implementable research products, and encouraging an increase in research engagement and research to practice improvement has been widely reported. Many suggest that practitioner engagement can be improved by practitioners participating in research. So in 2014, AIS New South Wales initiated an education research project which was designed to provide authentic opportunities for independent schools to undertake, access and utilise authentic educational research in their practice. One component of this was the provision of funding and support for schools to undertake school-based research projects. The key objectives of the School-Based Research Project initiative are to positively influence teachers' awareness, attitudes and interest in research activities, to address teachers' research training needs and build their capacity to undertake their own research in their own contexts, address the barriers and challenges that teachers face in engaging with some research, and in more clearly adopting evidence-informed practices, and to enhance teachers' use of research evidence to inform and improve their educational practices. We currently have 3 cohorts of school-based research projects involving 18 schools, over 16 projects. These schools are engaged in conducting school-based research in their own school context and across school contexts with AIS New South Wales support. The projects are undertaken by teachers and school leaders over a 2-year period. And the first cohort of projects have just completed their 2-year projects, and almost every single one of those is going to continue to research within that field of their it's not finished obviously, but the project that they engaged with, and if not to continue that, but to engage in other school-based research. The variety of projects that are undertaken by these schools highlights the spectrum of valued research interests, not only of these schools, but of the education sector more generally. More information about the nature and scope of the projects can be found on the AIS New South Wales website. Participation in a research project requires each school-based research project team to engage with a specialist or academic mentor. The relationship between the research project team and specialist mentor is an important one, as they work closely throughout the 2-year project. And as such, funding may be used to meet costs that are associated with this component of the project. Each year, applications are called for, and these are assessed against the set of criteria you can see in the left column. The process involves an internal AIS New South Wales process and an external process to ensure transparency. A small number of high-quality research projects are funded each year for that 2-year period. Funding is primarily used to provide time for research to be undertaken by educators from the schools in order to support increased research practice and literacy capability. As I mentioned earlier, it's also to meet any anticipated costs associated with specialist mentor or an academic mentor. Project teams attend a school-based research network meeting each quarter. These are facilitated by the AIS New South Wales Research and Data Division, and are designed to provide structured opportunities for teams and specialist mentors to network and share their findings in order to increase research capacity and literacy. We've found that the relationship between the specialist mentor is central to building and developing research capacity within each project team. And this opportunity to connect across teams throughout the timeframe has been of enormous value, both for the practitioners and the academics involved. Annually, we convene an education research symposium which provides opportunities for delegates to examine the most contemporary research being undertaken in independent schools and consider its impact on practice and student outcomes. In addition to presentations from leading education researchers, each school-based research project is able to share their research findings and current progress. Part of the commitment to participating in this initiative involves the project teams preparing and presenting both an interim and final report. These products are more widely disseminated via the AIS website. Part of the AIS Research and Data Division's team's vision and mission is to support and build practitioner capacity in engaging with research. We currently have 2 research associates that are employed to provide ongoing and specific support to the individual school-based research project teams, in addition to the specialist and academic mentor support that they receive. With the first cohort of school-based research projects recently completing their 2-year commitment, we have collected a range of rich data that demonstrates that being involved in this supported practitioner research initiative has benefited those involved in broad and varied ways. Many have reported that within their teams, and indeed across the wider school context, that practitioners feel they have a greater engagement with improvement strategies, a renewed enthusiasm for their craft, increased professionalism, and improved capacity and capability that is specifically related to research practice. And due to the success of this so far, we are committed to continuing to fund and to support these school-based research initiatives. So on that note, I'll hand over to Zoran Endikov to talk to you.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany, and hello everyone, and thank you for being here today on this very last day of what's been a great conference, I believe. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank the AARE executive for inviting the Research and Education Network to present. This is the second time we've presented at a conference, and I think, as Shani mentioned, it's a great opportunity for us, employees in various educational jurisdictions, education systems, to learn and get a first-hand experience of the research that's occurring across Australia. But also I think it's important that we share our knowledge and our experience with the research community in the hope that we bridge some of the gaps that have been discussed by my colleagues. I'll slightly change the topic of discussion. My colleagues presented or looked at the research and practice gap. I'll look at the research and policy relationship. I'll do that by sharing my department's experience in developing long-term research partnerships with academic institutions to develop an evidence base to inform our policy development. I'll particularly concentrate on and discuss some of the challenges and benefits that we identified through the partnerships, in the hope that it gives researchers some tips and hints in terms of engaging with government departments and ensuring that relationships are fruitful. So, I'll set the scene before I get into the partnership. So historically, the department used a number of models to access research and analytics, such as discrete commissioned research, ARC and NHMRC projects, existing relationships with research academics or researchers, and our research panel, which comprised research institutions, universities, consultancies, and individual researchers. And there were a number of drivers that influenced how we generated the evidence that we required. Two of those drivers were timelines of when the evidence was required and the capabilities and the capacity within the department. Now, in procuring and commissioning such projects, we faced a number of issues. There were ad hoc and duplicated research across the department. Quite often our data, and we have an extensive collection of data, was underutilised. There was limited ability to develop and build research and analytic capacity within the department. Because projects were discrete, quite often they didn't inform the department's strategic objectives, and the research that was emerging wasn't widely shared across the department. So in 2010, we started to think about ways to improve how we develop and procure research and analytic services. Research partnerships with academic institutions were seen as a different and potentially more effective model because they provide greater flexibility to explore more complex research, opportunity to develop the department's research and analytic capability, and an opportunity to better use our data sets. As such, the department sought expression of interest from the academic community to partner on long-term research program. And in 2011, the department commenced 3 research partnerships with 3 individual institutions for between 3 to 5 years. And I've listed the 3 successful partners there: Melbourne Institute, the Melbourne Graduate School, and the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. All 3 partners brought different but complementary skill sets and knowledge. The partnerships, or the expenditure from the department, was roughly $11 million, so it was a significant investment on our behalf, and there were over 50 projects that were completed. And in terms of establishing and managing the partnerships, we were very keen to work collaboratively and proactively with all partners to develop a research program of mutual benefit. I won't go into everything that's on the slide, but the partnerships worked on the principles of cooperation and commitment to build the evidence base. The partnerships were also underpinned by strong governance, both within the department and across the 3 partners. There was mutual respect for each other's autonomy and a shared vision to achieve the best possible outcomes for children, young people, and adults. Importantly, there was an intellectual freedom for the researchers to explore issues or to investigate the unknowns that we in the department would not have done otherwise. In doing that, a key aim was to build our capability to develop new analytical techniques in analysing our data sets and explore more research questions, more complex research and policy issues. In late 2013, we decided to undertake a review of the partnerships to get an understanding of the actual and perceived benefits and potentially identify opportunities that could improve the partnerships. Through surveys and in-depth interviews with stakeholders within the department and across the three partners, we identified a number of benefits and challenges. These are just some of the benefits. A key benefit, and this was the focus of the partnerships, was that we improved the utility of our data sets. The department collects a large volume of data. I commonly refer to this as a gold mine. We are limited in both capacity and capability in what we can do and how we can analyse the data. Through the partners, their statistical knowledge and ability to identify and explore innovative ways to analyse the data and also link the data in ways that we previously had not been able to, it enabled us to not only understand the data but also utilise it in a better way. As the partnerships evolved and matured, and as the partners learned more about the department, its policies, its data sets, and as we learned more about the partners and their capability and capacity, we were able to develop more complex research questions. The partnerships also enabled the department to access research capability not available within the department and access this capability very quickly. They're all based in Melbourne. Capabilities that the partners possess, particularly around econometric modelling or predictive modelling, it was really important in informing some of our thinking and some of our policy development. The research partners were also able to bring additional ideas and lines of inquiry from other research in other fields, other jurisdictions, both in Australia and overseas. Also, the partners acted as critical friends in our policy development. By funding and committing to long-term partnerships, the universities were able to attract academics with the relevant skill sets and knowledge to be able to respond to our research requests. The partnerships also enabled us to develop our critical thinking. It deepened our thinking and questioning of complex policy issues. Some of the research that identified causality enabled us to have much deeper and purposeful conversations within the department. And finally, a key benefit and aspect of the partnership was that the research and evidence was credible, it was reliable, and it was rigorous. It was produced by world-leading academics, which added to the policy discussion, and policymakers could not ignore or dismiss the research and the evidence. And some of the challenges, findings, I guess, the funding required to sustain a purposeful, ongoing and active partnership is substantial. As I mentioned earlier, these partnerships cost the department in excess of $11 million. And to sustain such an investment in tight fiscal environments is extremely difficult. At times, the researchers expressed frustration in terms of the time required in approving research reports through the department's authorising environment before they could be published. In most cases, we were required to brief the relevant ministers of the research findings and the impending publication. And for those of you that work in government, you'll clearly understand and know that there are a number of authorising environments before a briefing hits the minister. And as a result, each level of approval delays things. So as a result, the partners were extremely frustrated in our delay of approving the findings or approving the publications. Some of the final reports and the analysis provided was too complex and written in language not suitable for policy audience. As mentioned by my colleagues, this is a similar case for practitioners. Quite often we received reports that were the actual publications, academic journals publications themselves. Now these are written, as you most be aware, these are written for a different purpose and different audiences. So it was very, very difficult for us, for policymakers, to understand the research. As mentioned, time and effort is required up front and very early into the partnerships to make sure all parties involved understand each other. Its priorities to ensure that the research early on is targeted and purposeful, and also get some quick wins to develop momentum and buy-in. Sometimes the expectations about the research activity and the outcomes may not always align. By funding and committing to long-term... I think to some extent, in terms of the research and the outcomes not aligning, there was an expectation that every every project would lead to a new discovery and as such inform policy and practice, and that wasn't the case. Some of the research reaffirmed what was already known, and to some extent I think people within the department were disappointed with that. Also, sometimes the research questions couldn't be answered, and for a number of reasons. There were times where the data wasn't available, and there were instances where we thought we would be able to link the data, but we weren't able to. So as a result, the questions weren't able to be answered. Significant time and effort to maintain support and engagement. There was a perception that because the partnerships were run out of my area, that it was my area's partnership and not the department's partnership. So we required a lot of time and effort to sell the partnership to all members of the departments, and for them to see the value and benefit in using the partnerships as a good way to procure research and analytical services. There was also staff turnover. We had some restructure, some executives left the department, particularly champions of the partnership. So we had to re-establish relationships with the new executives as well. Within the department, there was a lack of understanding of the time required to undertake the research. There was a lack of understanding, particularly around the time required to cleanse the data and to link the data to other data sets. There was also unreasonable expectations from policy officers. For those who have worked in policy space, policy at times works very quickly. And as such, the expectations for policy officers in terms of turning research around, they had the same expectation of researchers to turn research around very quickly. And as I mentioned, that was very unreasonable expectation. As I mentioned, reports weren't suitable. The language wasn't accessible. So we spent a great deal of time understanding the reports, but then transcribing and translating the reports into summaries that were used across the department. And finally, some of the comments from the review identified that the partnerships of this nature is a commitment to a small number of researchers at the expense of being able to access knowledge and expertise from other researchers and other academic institutions. So this is just a quick snapshot and summary of our experience with the research partnerships. I hope it gives you some tips when you engage government departments, whether it's long-term or short-term commission research. Now I'll pass on to Associate Professor Mark Rickinson, who will summarise or wrap up the presentation.
Thanks, Doran. My name is Mark Rickinson. I'm from Monash University. I'm not a member of the Research and Education Network, but I'm delighted to be involved in the Research and Education Network Symposium. I can't think of a more important topic for discussion. If we're serious about what's written on this lectern, transforming educational research, then talking seriously about the research practice Nexus and enhancing it is crucial. I just want to share with you some, and they are starting questions, not concluding questions, even though it's the wrap-up session, sorry. They draw on three areas of work that I've been involved in. So there are three colours primarily in this picture, and it's work, big picture work around the relationship between research, policy and practice. So I was in the UK until about 3 years ago before I joined Monash, and I did some work with the European Commission around trying to improve the relationship between research, policy and practice there across the EU. Another piece of work I've been involved in is around user engagement. So it's very similar to Ange, what you were talking about in terms of what you're having in Queensland. That was a real priority for the Economic and Social Research Council, the UK's ARC. So I did work with Anne Edwards and Judy Seber at Oxford University around user engagement. And then thirdly, I guess the red picture on that, the red colour on that picture is work around evidence use. So the use of evidence in policy and in practice. So I've done a piece of work with the Department for Education and Training with Zoran and his colleagues recently here in Victoria, and I'm just about to start some work with Shani, Catholic Ed Melbourne, also about evidence use in practice. So what I've got are 4 questions. They're simple questions. I think they're important questions. You'll decide for yourselves what you think. I'm trying to draw on this kind of body of work to just raise some questions. The first one is about the who. Who are we working with? And this is about thinking within efforts to enhance the relationship between research and practice, who's involved? And the stimulus for this comes from a sociologist at Queen's University in Belfast who wrote a book called The Public Value of the Social Sciences. And it was trying to argue against a narrative or a discourse around impact and talk more about value. And I mean, the general argument I won't go into, but one of the specific points that Brewer makes is that there's been this tendency amongst social scientists to focus either on, you can see it on the screen, either, if you like, with practitioners and local community groups, or with people in positions of power. Now that's not necessarily relevant to research practice enhancements, but it's worth thinking about is to what extent are we open to working with different kinds of groups? A colleague of mine talks about the need for surprising alliances rather than predictable alliances. And so it's worth us reflecting on who's involved in enhancing in the kind of research practice nexus. So put another way, to take a kind of representation of the evidence ecosystem or the research practice, research policy interface, to what extent are we walking very particular routes or pathways through this kind of landscape of research production, research mediation, research utilization, and the broader context. So that's from Ben Levin in Canada, but it just gives us a way to think about who's involved in these kinds of projects that have been described. The second question is not so much about who, but it's really about what's the agenda that's driving efforts to enhance the research practice relationship. So this is about what are we focusing on? And really it's about to what extent are we able to quieten down our own agendas as we approach the research practice interface or the research policy interface. Let me give you an example from research policy interface, which is kind of like a subtle difference, but it's an important distinction that helps to flag up this idea of we need to reflect on what our agendas are when we try to link research and practice. So Carol Weiss is a US researcher who wrote, really started in many ways the field of knowledge utilization. And she started asking questions about the ways in which evaluation evidence was used in policy decision making. And she flagged up this distinction back in the 70s that social science researchers tend to want to improve the use of research in policy, but actually what's needed is people saying, how can we improve policy and what role might research play? The difference, as I said, the difference is subtle but important. For me, the left-hand side of that screen is a research impact mindset. The right-hand side of that screen is an evidence use mindset, and they're different. And so this is about research and policy, but it's worth reflecting on that in relation to research and practice. And you might say that's from quite a while ago, Mark. Haven't things changed? Well, a recent systematic review of evidence-based research, evidence-based policy research in the health field, in fact, flagged up that this had got worse, not better. So most of the research you can see on the screen was in that left-hand side, that research impact mindset, not an evidence-use mindset. And if we take policy out of that and think about in terms of practice, that's a helpful thing for us to reflect upon in terms of efforts to enhance the research practice interface. Okay, so that's two questions. The third question is, it's more about to what extent do we have humility when we approach research practice or research policy? It's how well do we actually understand? Now, almost all of the presentations so far, certainly Ange, Tiffany, Liliana, and Shani's actually, flagged up the complexity of research use in action. But when you look at writing, particularly from political scientists who are looking at the ways in which researchers try to get research evidence into the policy cycle, they're flagging up the naivety with which we approach it. So Paul Kenny, based at Stirling, has written a really interesting book recently, which is kind of flagging up the problems, or the ways in which environmental scientists and health scientists, health researchers and environmental researchers have tried to get research into the policy cycle, and they've misunderstood or not taken the time to appreciate the complexities and subtleties of the policy process. They've either got kind of unhelpfully naive views of evidence-based policy or unhelpfully cynical views, and there's no help in between. So that's a question. That's about science and it's about policy. So maybe it doesn't apply to us, but it's worth thinking about to what extent do we fall into that trap in relation to research, education research and education practice. And the other thing is, to what extent do we understand the complexity of the evidence use process? So Sandra Nutley's work at, again at Stirling University, the Research Utilisation Research Unit, which has been very influential within Europe anyway, in terms of trying to better understand evidence use. They flag up the idea that all too often we can be on the left-hand side of this screen in terms of actually how we enact improvements. When we try to improve the relationship between research and practice, we fall into the trap of acting as if evidence use is on the left-hand side of this screen. So it's individual, it's direct, etc. But everything that Shani said, and Ange said, and Liliana said, was about on the right-hand side of the screen. They talked about research use being collaborative. They talked about research use being conceptual rather than just instrumental. They talked about it not being only individual, etc., etc. So it's worth us reflecting on the extent to which we can fall into that trap of developing efforts to enhance the research practice nexus, which leave us on the left-hand side of that screen. The final question is one of relationships, and this comes to Zoran's idea where the department tried to initiate a quite different kind of setup between researchers and policymakers. A book published by researchers at the London School of Economics called The Impact of the Social Sciences, in exactly the same year as the John Brewer book about the public value of the social sciences. They have lots of infographics in there, and one of them is that they try to distinguish between different kinds of relationships between research and policy, or research and private sector, or research and public bodies. And this is, the detail of this is not important, but what is important is helping us to think about different configurations different configurations of relationships between players at the research practice interface. And then the other thing, going back to Anne Edwards at Oxford, who I did work with on user engagement, is the importance of recognising the expertise, the very specific type of expertise which is involved at working at the interface between practices. Anne calls this relational expertise, along with others, but to what extent do we recognise that in our efforts to enhance the research practice interface? So those are 4 starting, not concluding questions. And if there's any interest in the ideas that underpin those, that's a few references to work that I've been involved in which relate to those questions. Thank you.